Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. As you probably know, the governor's regulations say it's 50 is the limit for outdoor assemblies, and that's why I had to take very close count. We had exactly, I couldn't believe it, exactly 50 people, including our two storytellers tonight. So thank you for coming. Thank you for finding the registration ahead of time. I'm Thomas Ryan, the Vice Chair of the Eastham 400 Commemoration Committee. I want you to visit our website if you haven't done so, www.eastham400.org. Eastham400.org has close to 99 episodes describing the events of 1620 here in Eastham and their meanings for today. And also 5 hour-long programs about our history in 1620, the 1600s, up through today. We tried to give very special voice to the Mashpee Wampanoag who are still with us, and we also tried to give special voice to young people. So please visit our website, eastham400.org. John is going to introduce himself and Linda, and I'm very happy that both of them have joined with us.
Thank you, Tom. My name is John Hanlon. I work with the Wampanoag, or work for the Wampanoag tribe in the education department with high school kids as a youth counselor. And I also work for the National Seashore seasonally as an interpretive ranger, and I work at Cape Cod Community College in a program that we run for immigrant students. And I taught many years at Provincetown High School. So this whole story, when Tom asked me to join, really, something close to my heart. I love working with immigrants. I love that whole story. And what we tried to do for this 2020 program this year is kind of make it different from maybe what other places are doing, like Plymouth or Provincetown, who never actually did theirs. We did ours. But we want to make it about not only the Pilgrim story, but what is it like to be on Cape Cod now 400 years later? What is it like for Native people? What is it like for new people coming? What is it like for those of us who grew up here that maybe were told the story, the Pilgrim story, and now we're realizing there's a lot of different parts to it that maybe we didn't learn? So this has really been a great venue for that. And as Tom said, if you watch the different 10-minute segments every day online, and then also the hour-long segments like this, you'll see a real variety of voices. You'll see students, immigrant students from the college. You'll see students I used to have in Provincetown who are DACA recipients. You'll see Native American kids from Mashpee that I work with that really offered a different perspective. You'll see Earl Mills, who is known as Chiefy, who's one of the Mashpee Nine, if you know that story, and how that relates to all that's going on with racial injustice in our country today. So it's a huge story, beyond just the Pilgrims, but we're going to talk mostly about that era of the 1600s tonight. And with me tonight is Linda Coombs. I'll let Linda introduce herself.
Well, he wasn't lying. My name is Linda Coombs, and I am from the Aquinnah Wampanoag tribe. And John or Tom mentioned the Mashpee, and I have my 2 grandchildren with me, one of whom is wandering in the back there. The other is, I got my eye on them. They're from the Mashpee tribe. My background has been in museums, where I started in 1974, which really wasn't that long ago. Can't convince me otherwise. And I started out at the Boston Children's Museum, where I worked for a total of 11 years. I worked at Plymouth Plantation in the Wampanoag Indigenous Program for 30 years, and more recently at the Aquinnah Cultural Center, which is a small house museum out in Aquinnah, right up by the cliffs, the old Vanderhoop homestead. and have since been doing consultant work still with museums, most recently with Wellfleet Historical Society and the Mashpee Wampanoag Museum. And that's what I do. I do history and interpreting history, trying to get the indigenous perspective or Wampanoag perspective, out there, because there's a lot of people that still don't realize we still exist at all. So I'd like to sort of change their minds about that.
Okay, thanks, Linda. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to start out with a little bit of history, some of the facts and maybe information that may be new to some of you or maybe not. And then Linda will talk about some of the Wampanoag traditions, cultural traditions. Then I'll read a kid's book, and then Linda will offer some information about some books about Native people and other things, to make a more contemporary, so that you leave with a more contemporary message and view of the Wampanoag. So normally when we do a campfire program, like at the seashore, we have a little more interactive, but with the social distancing and all this year, we're not going to do that. So, but I do want it to be interactive in the sense that if you have questions, I want you to ask, or if I ask a question, if you want to, feel free to shout out. Okay. All right. So I think to start about a story about the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag is really to start out about this peninsula that we live on, Cape Cod. Does anyone know how it came to be, according to what we've learned from scientists? A glacier, yes, a giant glacier, and it built this pile of sand from the ground-up rocks of northern New England, and of course Route 6 is built on what we call the moraine, the high point, and then we have the coastal plains, and we have the great cliffs of the outer Cape, and the whole post-glacial sand dunes of Provincetown. So the whole history of this area is really starts there with how this place was formed. So that was about 12,000 years ago that people, or rather that the ice retreated and the landform started to resemble what it does today. Of course, Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard were mountains on the landscape. They weren't islands as the sea continued to rise. Now that all changed. And that's when people started to come live here. Of course, it was, thousands of years later before the European people came here. But Linda's going to talk a little bit about the native perspective on the creation story.
Well, according to our history, I never use the term creation story, because the word story often, is akin to myth and legend or fable, fairy tale, something that isn't real. And our creation is real. My point in that is to try to get out the point that our history and the way that we relate it through various stories is just as viable as any other method or any other people's methodology. So as John mentioned, at one point this was all solid land after the glaciers retreated, and that's at the point that the Wampanoag people, at least as far as we know, we weren't here before that, but that's when we came here. And back in those days, we lived, the edge of the land was where George's Bank is now. And the Ojibwe people lived there. And we had a person called Masha. And that word, I'm not sure if it's the exact word from the Wampanoag language, but it means great man or large man, because he was a giant. And unlike the rest of us humans, he was made directly by the Creator. Okay, not born of woman, but made directly by the Creator. So he was almost like the Creator. And giants could be 40 to 60 feet tall, or the size of the tallest pine tree, which are our ancestors, by the way. And they could be 150 to 200 feet tall. And I think Moshup was in that latter category because they could grab whales. They were large enough to grab whales by the tail, and we know that Moshup did that because on Gay Head or Aquinnah we have a lot of stories about how Moshup fed the Wampanoag people with whales. And the water rose one day because Moshup dragged his toe and the water came in. And it rose to the point where it left the Cape and the islands pretty much the way it looks now. And at some point, I'm not sure, I don't have the exact dates lined up in my mind to tell you, but apparently there was a lot of fighting going on the mainland. And so Moshup basically said, well, I gotta get to a place that's a lot more quiet and peaceful, and anybody that wants to come with me is welcome to come. And so that's when he went over to what is now Aquinnah or Gay Head, and out to the cliffs. I don't know if anyone's been out to the cliffs, but they're very famous because they're made of colored clay, red, yellow, black, and white, essentially. In those days, the cliffs were all white. And they later became colored because, as I said, he was catching whales, and he would smack the whales against the cliffs, and their blood would stain the clay red, the red clay. And then he would cook the whale meat, and that's how he fed the Wampanoag people. And the black clay or gray clay comes from the ashes from his fire. And a few years ago, they moved the Gay Head Lighthouse 135 feet inland so it wouldn't topple over the cliff. And there were a number of archaeologists and geologists involved in the whole move and everything, because some very unusual features were revealed when the lighthouse was lifted up and actually moved. And one of those gentlemen, a man by the name of Byron Stone, who's a geologist, came and spoke at the Aquinnah Cultural Center, which is just across the Aquinnah Circle from the lighthouse, about this one very, strange anomaly, geologically speaking. And he reacted to these Moshup stories like many people, that, oh yeah, those are fairy tales, they don't mean anything, they're just for entertainment. And when I was talking about the red clay being from the whale's blood, he was like, well, there is an element in that clay that's like blood or iron. And the black clay, he says, it does have some sort of chemical element in it that is akin to charcoal. And I was like, see? Told you they weren't just fairy tales. So we just had creative ways to keep our history and to bring it to, our generations of people. So now I will turn it back over to John.
Okay, so if you drive down the end of this road, where do you end up? What's that place? First Encounter Beach, right? And what is the first encounter? Well, so we tend to think of the first encounter as the first encounter between the native people here and the separatist people from England, or known as Pilgrims. But it may have been the first encounter of native people for them, but it certainly wasn't the first encounter for the native people here of Europeans. So that's one thing, to keep in mind as we commemorate this anniversary. In the year 1000, the Vikings explored the area. In the 1480s, British fishing vessels were in Newfoundland. In the 1500s, 1600s, up to the 1600s, European fishing vessels were exploring this area, fishing for cod. And in 1602, Cape Cod got its name. By who? Anybody know? Bartholomew Gosnold, right? Because supposedly the cod were so thick you could walk across the water on them. And then things started to have more of an impact. 1603, Martin Pring, known as a discoverer, he was English, and this is when violence began. He built a fortress at what is today Provincetown, and he traded with the native people that he met. And he sicked his dogs on them. Then in 1605, there was an explorer from France who was in what's now the Chatham area. Anyone know who that may be? Champlain. Yeah, and he actually sailed right into Nauset Marsh, right up here in Eastham as well. And he had some sort of a standoff, violent standoff with the Nauset people that he met. When we talk about the Wampanoag, the Nauset people were Wampanoag. They were the people that lived in this area. Down in Chatham, it would have been the Monomoic people. Then in 1614, Captain Thomas Hunt stole 27 Wampanoag men. 20 from Patuxet, which is up where what we now call Plymouth, in the area where those Pilgrims finally settled. And 7 of those men were from the Nauset, from this area. So how many people, like the kids, do you guys learn about that in your history class? About people being stolen? No. And so he fooled them by getting them to come on board to trade, because the Wampanoag people had been very used to trading. There were many things that the English had that they found useful, and then the English liked the pelts and things like that. And he took them as slaves, those 27 men, and he sold them along with the fish that he brought back to Spain. And among them was Tisquantum, or we know him as Squanto. That's the name we always hear about with the Thanksgiving story, right? And he was held captive in Spain for 5 years. He made his way back, and he was involved in that whole Thanksgiving story, but did you ever think how he knew how to speak English? Right? Because he had been held captive with English-speaking people for all those years. In 1615, the Micmacs, who were the tribe from what's now Canada, they obtained guns from the French that were exploring in their area. And they started to raid different native groups in what is now Maine, causing the Wampanoag people to fear that they could be next. So the scene was starting to be set for some kind of maybe need for protection, right, with these different groups that were coming in. The Wampanoag were a network of villages at that time living here. I'm not going to say that. Yeah, I'm not going to say that. As I said, the group from here were known as the Nausets. Then in 1616, there was a mysterious illness that we think came from those Micmac people that was brought to them by French fishermen that were in the area. This was a disease that didn't affect Europeans as much, but it was lethal to the native people, because most of those diseases came from livestock, and there were no livestock in the Western Hemisphere, so there was no opportunity to provide any kind of immunity. Now, last week someone asked what that disease was, and we're not really sure, but I did a little research since then. There's something called leptospirosis, which is a bacterial disease that carried in rats. Of course, there were many rats in Europe and on those ships. So, and that ravaged the population from 1616 to 1619. It ravaged the population. About 90% of the population in some areas, like in Plymouth, were lost, the native population. Not as much down here on the Cape. So in 1620, of the 2,000 residents of Patuxet, that area that's now Plymouth, that population was decreased by about 90%. And then in 1620, the Nauset people standing on the cliffs here, which at that time were much further out than they are now, right, 400 years worth of erosion, they would have seen the Mayflower coming right in here around Eastham. They would have seen it. And they would have known, they had plenty of history at this point, as is clear, who these people were, what, maybe not that this group is actually planning to settle here, but they were quite familiar. They were already integrated into these folks from Europe coming over. But they didn't land in Eastham. Where did they go? Does anybody know? Eventually Provincetown, yeah, they actually took a left and they went south because they were planning to go to the Hudson Bay area, but they couldn't get around the shoals of Monomoy. So they did a U-turn, came back, settled in Provincetown Harbor, what's now Provincetown Harbor. It's a natural harbor, so it was there then. It's the second deepest natural harbor in the world, actually. And they stayed there for about five weeks, exploring the area before they ended up going over to Plymouth. So let's talk about that a little bit. In 1620, King James issued a patent to a group of English, not the separatists, not the Pilgrims, but a group that founded the Massachusetts Bay and New Hampshire colonies. And this is what he said in that patent. By God's visitation reigned a wonderful plague, which resulted in the depopulation of the whole territory, leaving them deserted by their natural inhabitants. So it's a little bold maybe for a king to grant a patent for a land that doesn't belong to him anyway, but he saw this as an opportunity to give these people the legal right, in their minds anyway, to settle this new land. So on September 6, 1620, 150 passengers crammed aboard the Mayflower. They actually had a second ship, the Speedwell, but they had a lot of trouble getting that fixed, and time was running out, and at this point they were in Holland. Of course, they had lived there for several years. So they left, finally, 150 of them, half of them separatists, half of them just people that were on board to make money. Right? They needed to have more, they needed to have the boat full to make it commercially viable. They set sail, and then on November 9th, they spotted land here in Eastham. So it was about an 9-week trip. November 11th, after doing that little circuitous route that we talked about, they settled in Provincetown Harbor. This land known as Turtle Island. This is what this land was known as to the people that actually lived here. November 11th, they came to sign what was known as the Mayflower Compact. So one of my other jobs, I give tours on the Mayflower Trolley in Provincetown. And we tell people the Mayflower Compact was the founding document of this republic, this democracy that became the United States. Right? Not really that accurate. The original document, it was an unusual statement of self-government because it was in a time of kings, right? And it still pledged loyalty to the king. It's never been found, this document, which is interesting. I didn't realize that. But like most English, these separatists believed they had the right to move to America, and their king had the right to grant them this land. And so they created this document. Really, the main reason they created it was because, in their mind, their grant was to south of here, and they were now in land that they thought they weren't entitled to, and half the people with them weren't part of their religious group, so they thought they could turn against them because there was no law establishing any authority. So that was the real reason why they created this document. Of course, only the men signed it. And they chose John Carver, one of their leaders, as the governor. November 13th, they repaired the boat and they washed their clothes. November 15th, 16 men went ashore, among them Miles Standish and Stephen Hopkins. And they walked to what's today Truro, and they saw 6 native people with a dog there. They found fresh water there. This is one of the spots, one of the National Seashore trails. Anyone know where that spot is? What the trail is called? Pilgrim Spring Trail, yeah. They found, so they walked across to the bayside. They found corn that was buried. And they, quote, dug it up and took it with them until they could carry no more, promising to later make amends with the native folks who they assumed it belonged to. Anyone know what this place is called today? Corn Hill. You guys are very smart. On November 16th, they returned to the area. They took the rest of the corn. They found graves. They went back to Provincetown. On December 6th, 10 men set out again in a shallop, a small boat, while the woman stayed back in the harbor on the Mayflower. They saw native people along the shore in the Cape Cod Bay cutting up a dead pilot whale, something they referred to as a grampus. They followed them into the woods. They couldn't catch up to them, but they found all kinds of evidence of native people where they were living. The next night, December 7th, they spent the night on the shore down here at what we now call First Encounter Beach, and they shot their guns off during the night just to test them. Of course, all this time, the native people, I'm sure, were watching them. They may not have seen them, but I'm sure the natives were watching them. And shooting these guns off may have indicated that maybe they had not so great intentions. So during the night, they heard the cries of native people in the surrounding woods. At daybreak, shots or arrows were fired. Shots were returned. 18 arrows were recovered. No one was killed. Because of the currents, they actually ended up that day drifting across the bay to Plymouth, and just by chance finding this area that was clear because 90% of the people had died. And they came back to get the rest of the crew in Provincetown, and they decided on the 16th they would go there and have their settlement.
I'm going to talk a little bit about what our traditional life was like, because a lot of times people think that the way that we lived was backward or primitive or undeveloped or not advanced or, unsophisticated, simple or simplistic and all of that sort of thing. And that was not the case at all. Okay. Basically, we lived in winter villages like Nauset, for example, would have several sites where people would spend the winter, like 2 or 3, because the type of houses that we had, the weetus or the long houses, would last about 10 to 12 years before needing to be rebuilt. And so when that occurred, people would move in the next winter to new houses in another site, and they could live there for 10 years or so, and then to a third site. So by the time they got back to the first one, probably the main reason that people would move in the first place was because they were having to walk too far away from home to gather firewood. And also the bathroom facilities are going to need a natural cleansing action. And, 10 or 20 years later, that would be accomplished. In the summertime, people spread out by individual families along rivers, along the shore, along ponds and lakes, which are the bottomlands. Okay, on the edge of the water is always the bottomlands, and that's the best soil for growing crops. And we had been planting corn for about 1,500 years from now. So roughly, 1,000 or 1,100 years at the time of the Pilgrim's arrival. And each family would grow 1 to 2 acres of corn, beans, squashes, pumpkins, melons, and sunflowers. And one family would use a planting field for 5 or 6 or 7 years in a row. And you've all heard, I'm assuming, of fertilizing with herring. And that was not done every year, but only maybe the first year, or if they had to stay there 7 years or 8 years or whatever was going on. It wasn't every year. And then the family would move to a different planting field for the following several years, so that the first area could lie fallow. I always used to think that, if you could look at it from a aerial view, it would look like a big patchwork quilt with planted fields, with fallow fields, with forest areas, with fields, or whatever, swamps and ponds and bogs and all the rest of it. And when the English came here, they described the area as like paradise. Okay, because they were huge trees. The trees were 100 feet tall. It would take 6 of us holding hands before we could encircle one or more. They were that huge, and there's none of that left because it was all cleared after contact for farming and shipbuilding and this sort of thing, pasturing domesticated animals. But when it was just Wampanoag people, Native people have what we call original instructions. And those were given to us at the time of creation by the Creator. And we say that everything in creation is still following their original instructions. It's only the humans that have sort of wandered way off the path. Bears are still being bears, the trees are still doing tree things, the grass is still doing grass, the fish are fish. Only the humans have strayed. And our job was given to us that we were to keep creation as the Creator made it. Okay? And we could take whatever we needed to eat, for clothing, for warmth, for medicine, for shelter, whatever your needs are. But when you do that, you can't just take and then the buck stops there. When you take, there's responsibility that comes with that. And if you take the life of a deer, then the responsibility is to provide the deer what they need for their lives, which is the woods. Okay? So that's sort of a short and sweet and kind of simple example of the reciprocity that was just inherent, in our culture. And the English didn't understand that. They just thought we didn't know any better, so that's how we lived like we did. To them, we were like the wild Irish, because they also wore animal skins and lived in houses made from natural things and painted their faces and bodies, and so they thought we were like them. But we lived in what was called right relationship. And as we've mentioned tonight, we lived here at least since the glaciers retreated. And in 1620, that's, coming forward about 12,000 years. So we lived that way for 12,000 years, and the English walked into paradise. Okay, that's what the landscape looked like. Because there were just fish and animals in the millions, plenty of deer, plenty of turkeys, plenty of fish, plenty of shellfish, everything. All the plants. And the other thing that we did was we made use of fire. I feel like someone's following me now. Because we burned over our gardens. We burned the underbrush. at least in the areas around where we lived and where we traveled through. And so the landscape was kept. I recently read a book. Well, I didn't read the whole thing because it's like really thick, but I did read the introduction. And it was about the Indians of California, and the title is called "Tending the Wild," which just really caught my attention. And in that, there was a man who was describing, how the California Indians did the same thing. And I said, well, maybe I can, translate into Wampanoag, whatever they're saying the practices were. Because I knew that Wampanoag people burnt the gardens and the underbrush and all of that, but I never saw those two activities as fitting into a larger system of interrelating and interacting with the earth in a way that enhanced the earth and made it better for the animals or the plants and for the people, okay? Which is very different from the philosophies and minds, or lack of philosophy and mindset that are in operation today when we're at the brink of destruction. And it astounds me that, I meet people all the time that, oh yeah, well, you guys didn't know any better. Yeah, we did. We did. And so I have here a note. I think most people have seen the film We Still Live Here about the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project. And one of the most revealing things in that film to me was when the young lady was talking about the creation history of how Creator made us first from stone, and we were clunky, and we didn't love each other enough. And the Creator says, okay, you guys are out of here, and he got rid of those people, and he made us out of the white pine. And we did love each other enough, and we're rooted in the ground and yet connected to the sky. And so that's why the evergreens stay green, because they did love each other enough. And when Wampanoag people in the language, in our own language, when we introduce ourselves, and we say where we're from rather, like I would say, Nutomas Aquinnah Hanut. I am from Aquinnah. But it's not just simple like, oh yeah, that's where I come from. What that word actually means, if you were to break it down into the root words and all of that, linguistic stuff that I don't really understand, but it means that like my DNA comes from Aquinnah, because I'm related to that land. The land and me are the same thing. You all come from someplace else. So, and I don't know, and there was a point in time when your ancestors felt the same way, because I've met people from Poland and from Scotland. At Plymouth one time I was absolutely floored, because I was working in the garden and a gentleman approached me, and he wanted to know about our religion. And and I'm like, okay, because that's sort of a subject that we don't get into too deeply, because we don't know what people are going to do with the information. So I sort of spieled out my standard answer about the four directions and whatever. And he listened, and he was like, oh, he says, because I'm Polish American, and I've just recently went to Poland to visit relatives who are Catholic, and they were getting ready to go to church to baptize a child. And everyone else had put their coat on and gone out to get in the car, and the mother took the baby, and she was still in the house, as I remember, and she went to each of the four directions. And when she did, she stopped and said like a little prayer. Then she put on her coat and went to the car. Could have knocked me over with a feather, because I was like, it's the same thing. Same thing, And there was a gentleman from Scotland who came like 2 different years. And I recognized him because there was a year in between. And he recognized me, and we had these long conversations about Mother Earth. You know, so it's there. And I think years ago at the plantation, a book came into the shop, and it's called The Earth Knows My Name. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's beautiful. And I didn't read the book, but I was flipping through it and just reading, you know, like the cover and all of that. And it was about people who come from other countries, and, you know, they're not in their homeland, they're not in their own home, their family might not be with them, they don't know anybody where they are in this country, they don't speak the language, there's 100 things that leaves them isolated. And the one thing that began to make them feel welcome and at home was when they went out and worked in a garden and got their hands in the earth and got their feet on the earth. So what all that tells me is that there's a huge connection that we all need to look at again, because it's real, okay? And we can save the earth, and it can save us as well.